Following their herds, they ascend to the meadows of the southern Taurus Mountains. Who are these people? Just like the nomadic Kurdish tribes of southeast Anatolia, they migrate from the steppes to the meadows at the beginning of summer, and from meadows to steppes at the onset of winter, to find better pasture and weather for their animals, living in tents with neither land nor houses to their name. The Yıllık people, a 1,000-year-old culture and lifestyle gradually disappearing. Maybe this primitive life in the natural beauty of Anatolia, which our children may never see, will be remembered not with romantic nostalgia, but as a struggle to survive. The nomadic culture and social life of the Yıllıks and the eastern Kurdish tribes is not essentially different. Just as rent is paid for winter housing and feed for animals, at stopping off points on their migration they pay for grazing rights. Without paying a price per animal, they cannot stay on land belonging to villages. Aside from the difference in languages, where the Yıllıks use camels, the eastern Kurdish tribes use strong pack horses and mules. The Yıllıks' livelihood is based primarily on goats, whereas that of the eastern Kurds depends on sheep. This journey may take 1 or 2 months, depending on the season and natural conditions. For these people who want to reach the pastures as soon as possible, this arduous journey hardly counts as work. For them, it is life itself. Without television or newspapers, these mountains and paths make up a world they would never give up. The hardest part is the breaks in their journey. Even if the break is only for one night, all the animals' packs have to be unloaded and bedding unpacked. Tents have to be pitched before sunset. After the strongest men and women of the tribe have pitched the tents, everyone gathers in them. Instruments are played, songs are sung, and the weariness of the day is forgotten. Most of the daily work in these tents falls to the women. Making butter and cheese, cooking, and similar chores are an indispensable part of these women's lives. Every tent has a rifle, since with the men often away, women need to deal with any kind of threat. Rolling out dough and straining milk are also part of the daily routine. After the sheep and goats have been sheared and the wool combed, spinning the wool is the task of the young women. The young women of the tribe help their mothers. Their spare time is filled with embroidery or lacework. Yıllık rugs are sold widely. Right next to the tents, the girls and women weave these traditional rugs that are famous throughout Anatolia. A loom and a shady awning are enough for this work. Now they have reached the summer pastures, the life of the nomadic tribes is far more lively, colourful and productive than it was in their winter quarters. Wherever they pitch their tents, there must be grazing land, water and bushes for firewood nearby. Water is carried for cooking, washing up and, boiled in cauldrons, for washing clothes. The Alican and Beritan are the largest nomadic tribes of eastern Anatolia. However, their traditional grazing rights have been largely lost, and especially as a result of terrorism, this thousand-year-old way of life is gradually being eroded. Small children struggle to survive in the unforgiving conditions of the mountains. Those who live grow up quickly. In spite of everything, births and marriages go on. The tent with the red flag is for a wedding. For the nomadic tribes, a wedding is both a sacred event and a chance to enjoy themselves. If there is a wedding in one of the tribes, everyone knows and everyone is invited. A family with 500 sheep is considered rich, and its wedding celebrations can last for days. Every tribe has its characteristic music and dances. In the less conservative tribes, women and men dance together. In proposing marriage, the bride price is an inescapable tradition. Before a wedding, the boy's father visits the tent of the girl's father and negotiates the price. After agreeing on a suitable price, the couple are betrothed and the wedding date is fixed. Wealthy and influential families require a higher bride price, and the wedding is correspondingly sumptuous. A dance group is fetched from a nearby town to perform the folk dances of that region. While dances go on in and around the tent of the groom, his close relatives go on horseback to fetch the bride. The tent prepared for the bride is cleaned and food prepared, but the groom takes part in none of these frantic preparations. The bride's family will not give up the girl without a present known as kapagar. Marriage is a young man's first step to acquiring status in the tribe. Later, fathering children and performing his military service will show him worthy of respect. The bride's father leads her out between the horses. Her head is covered, and the groom may not see her face until the imam has said prayers and the marriage ceremony is concluded. For women in the nomadic tribes, marriage is not enough to confer status. Giving birth is also required. Only after becoming a mother will she receive the headscarf called a pushi, which marks her status in the society. Just as the sun sets over the 3,000-meter peaks of Anatolia, the dreams and passions of these homeless people, clinging to a hard life in a beautiful but pitiless environment, are slowly disappearing. These meadows, which are covered in snow in winter, burst out with life and fertility. The crater lakes, which are completely frozen in winter, provide a vital source of health-giving mineral waters for the nomads. Among the many tasks that make up the tiring day is milking, which provides the staple food for the nomads. When the lengthening shadows indicate that evening is coming, the milking begins. Neighbouring tents help each other so that they can milk 300 to 500 animals before nightfall. The foaming milk is collected in buckets to be made into cheese. It is pressed in goat skins. Yogurt and curds are hung up in bags. Amongst people whose only livelihood is herding, lambs and kids are looked after as carefully as their children. Because of terrorism and various restrictions, over the last 20 years the number of sheep and goats owned by Anatolian nomads has dropped from 25 million to 5 million. The wool of these sheep and goats is as valuable as their milk. Once sheared, the wool is made into tents, sacks, cloth and felt. In the tribes, shearing is traditionally man's work, as is selling the wool to merchants in nearby towns. The raw wool bought from the nomads is stored in the merchants' depots. Once the wool has been cleaned of dirt and burrs, the craftsman who makes the felt will negotiate a price per kilo. Carding the wool used to be performed by hand, but is now done by the carpet manufacturer. These days few people know the traditional willow bow with its gut bowstring. Today, both carding and throwing are done by combing machines. For a price, the felt manufacturer will comb the wool to a state where it can be used for felt. In making carpets and felt, natural vegetable dyes are still used in preference to chemical dyes. The dyer picks the plants himself, then dries the roots. The roots are ground to produce the basic colours that are used to dye the wool used for carpets and felt. Just as the traditional culture of the nomads is disappearing, felt making is one of the dwindling traditional crafts of Anatolia. In Konya, the felt maker Mehmet Usta is struggling both to keep his business afloat and to introduce this traditional craft to the world. These felt makers are continuing a tradition that goes back to the 12th century, and in a spirit of brotherhood and cooperation, there is an unspoken agreement not to copy each other's designs. Here, Mehmet Usta is making a shepherd's cape, decorated with his own original designs. Soapy water helps in placing the designs on the fabric. The main factors in the making of felt are water, soap, heat and pressure. As with the dyes, chemicals are not used in any part of felt making. We see here an individual creative process. Without using any kind of pattern, the master craftsman improvises on his own designs. This important process is called sachma. After the sachma process, the embroidered design is covered by the white wool. However, when the whole process of felt making is completed, the colours will show through brightly on the surface. After this process is complete, a little hot or cold water, according to the temperature, is sprinkled onto the surface of the wool with a brush. This process is called ıslama. After the sachma and ıslama processes have been performed on the high-quality white wool, a layer of lower-grade light grey wool is used for the inside of the cape. After checking the consistency and, if necessary, adding a little more wool, a process of adjustment called siftime is carried out. Since this is a kind of demonstration or workshop, Mehmet Usta is probably thinking of producing the best cape ever. Now he is preparing the hood. Just as the cape is embroidered on both sides, so is the hood. It will be a lucky shepherd who gets to wear this one. Hand-prepared vegetable dyes in red, blue and yellow are used for this design. The profession of goat herding goes back to ancient times. After the nomadic tribes began to settle down and Anatolia came under the control of the Seljuk and Ottoman Turks, this, like other trades, was regulated by the state under the semi-feudal archi system. After the siftime process, 3 men wind the wool carefully and evenly inside a wicker mat. This process is known as dürme. Canvas or nylon sacking, known as kalapdesh or kalapgesh, is placed over the wool and tightly wound over the mat, after which it is tied to keep it in place. After tying the wicker with 5 cords, we progress to the stage known as örleme or kicking. 2 or 3 people roll the bundled wool for about an hour by kicking it from one end of the workshop to the other. They apply extra pressure by placing their hands on their knees. With one foot on the floor for balance, the other foot rolls the wool first forwards, then backwards. After an hour of the kicking process, the wool, which has now turned to felt, is slowly unrolled. The designs on the front and reverse of the felt are now revealed in their true colours. Before the second kicking process, the edges that will go on the inside are tidied up by curling them. This is known in some areas as kapaklama and in others as çatkı yapma. Mehmet Usta and his son work on the hood of the cape without using any stitches. While they work, let's take a look at the history of felt, which extends 4,000 years back to the Sumerians. There are references to the manufacture and use of felt in the Code of Hammurabi. Item 274 states, if a man hires a craftsman, and if this craftsman is a felt maker, he shall pay him a sum of silver per day, equivalent in weight to 5 grains of barley. The headgear depicted in representations of Anatolian Hittite gods and nobles is reminiscent of the felt headpieces of the Ottomans and the tall felt hats of the Mevlevi whirling dervishes. Mentions of felt in Hittite lore also indicate that its use was widespread. The Hittite practice of making headgear from felt later spread to the Phrygians, whose distinctive felt caps are mentioned in historical accounts. The statue of the god King Midas is a good example of this style. From documents, paintings and sculptures, we can see that both the Greeks and Romans made considerable use of felt clothes and accessories. The Turkish horsemen of the steppes used a large number of felt items made from the wool of their many sheep. As well as everyday use, many objects made from felt had sacred significance. Chinese writers mention that Turks produced and traded large quantities of felt, using it for many purposes, including making felt statues to represent the spirits of deceased relatives. We know that in the 11th century, the Oğuz Turks traded in felt as well as sheep, and that the Gürk Turks not only wore felt but lived in felt tents. Throughout history, Central Asian Turks have used felt for tent making, and even up to 50 years ago, the Turkomans lived in large felt tents in their pastures. Simpler versions of these tents survive to this day. The Seljuk Sultan Keykubat, who played a major role in developing the Turkish state in Anatolia, was the first of his line to introduce a uniform for his soldiers, achieving this by the simple measure of showing them a felt hat and ordering everyone to wear the same one. We know that later, during the Ottoman Empire, the Janissaries used felt for many purposes, from their headgear to their shoes. The headgear known as burk, which was introduced during the reign of Orhan Bey, was made from white felt. The cape made here by Mehmet Usta is a beautiful example of traditional Anatolian handcrafts. The fact that no stitching is used, even to attach the hood to the cape, adds greatly to its value. with its hood, the cape, which has been decorated on both sides, is once again rolled up for another hour of the örleme process. However, to complete its transformation into felt, it is necessary to cook the cape. Mehmet Usta carries the cape on his back to the bathhouse. These Turkish baths, now known as the Feltmaker's Baths, were originally called the Sultan Baths and formed part of a complex of buildings commissioned by the Seljuk vizier Sahip Ata from the architect Abdullah Bey 747 years ago. They were restored by a foundation, and part of them was reserved for the use of felt makers. In some areas, the felt makers wear knee-length drawers, while elsewhere they wear loincloths. Together with his son, who is following in his footsteps, Mehmet Usta gets ready to spend 4 or 5 hours in the heat of the baths. In the first stage, the felt is opened and carefully soaked with hot water. In olden times, the felt makers of Anatolia would urge each other on by singing folk songs. After the felt has been thoroughly soaked and wrapped up again, yet another process of pressing it with the feet begins. Every 5 minutes they change direction and start again. This is the most tiring part of making a cape, and cooking the cape takes the work and sweat of 2 strong men. These 2 people have to work at a fixed pace in perfect synchronization. The cape is again opened up, wetted, levelled, and finally turned around and wrapped up again. This process takes approximately 2 hours. In opening up and levelling the cape, it is pinched and punched to thicken the thin areas and thin the thick areas. Bringing the cape to the desired thickness and consistency is called karıştırma, or mixing. The father and son roll the cape with their arms while pressing their knees against the floor. This binds the wool fibres to each other and continues the process of stretching and levelling, which was first performed standing up. Mehmet Usta rolls the rolled-up cape back and forth along the floor with his knees, a process which is aptly named dizleme, or kneeing. This packs and hardens the felt, and with a large cape like this, it requires skill as well as strength. Mehmet Usta is nearing the end of his work on his cape, which has taken him 2 days. After a last kicking in the baths, the cape is washed and left to dry. However, these days, the traditional method of felt making is being abandoned, as the use of machinery becomes widespread. After a few final adjustments, the cape is hung up in the shop to await a buyer. The product and craft of felt, which was for centuries a basic need of the people of Anatolia, now has a completely new face as an art form and design which is becoming popular worldwide. Here we see how felt cloth is prepared. Instead of the matting mould used for making the cape, a fine weaved nylon fabric is sufficient. After being wound carefully, the wool is rolled until it turns to felt. This fabric, produced without any weaving, is later dried, after which it is made into bags, coats, cardigans, and small decorative objects. This is a different art. The felt makers of Anatolia, who originally produced capes, tents, floor coverings and prayer mats, are now continuing to provide the world with creative artistic products by turning their hand to hats, clothes, small decorative figures and even bridal gowns. Here we see how felt is prepared to make a hat. The varied forms of hats that have been made in Anatolia for centuries are now an indispensable product for modern fashion designers. Wool is chosen according to the colour of the hat to be made, and after the wool has been made into felt, it can be placed into whichever mould is desired. Nowadays, production methods, while developing the original techniques, still do not depart from the tradition. Better quality and more thoroughly cleaned wool is used. Most importantly, the ability of felt to preserve its form like a shell has allowed felt makers to take the two-dimensional sacred figures of the original Turks and remake them in 3 dimensions. Moving from the hats of today back to the turbans of yesteryear, we can see Mehmet Usta's work at the tomb of the Sufi poet Rumi, Mevlana, in Konya.